Seriously, though, can you imagine life these days without endlessly scrolling?
Yeah,
It's crazy, right?
oh, absolutely. Social media is everywhere.
Everywhere. And get this, by 2024, get this, over 5 billion people
Wow.
were on social media. 5.24 billion to be exact. That's like what? Two-thirds of everyone on the planet.
I mean, it's a staggering number.
Really?
Really highlights how integral these platforms are in our lives.
For better or worse.
For better or worse, exactly. And that's what we're going to be getting into today with a really interesting study. It's from 2025 by Delogu and some other researchers.
Okay.
The title is a mouthful. The impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on the use of social media across national comparison. It was published in Acta Psychologica.
So this study offers a really unique lens, because the pandemic, with all that social distancing and isolation, it's like this huge natural experiment almost in how we use digital tools to stay connected when we can't physically be together. Yeah, and that's what we're hoping to uncover today. How did that unprecedented isolation affect our social media habits? They looked at folks in the USA and Italy, compared students to full-time workers, and they even factored in personality and life satisfaction.
Yeah, and it's important to remember, even before COVID-19 hit, we knew social media was this double-edged sword, right?
Right.
Amazing for keeping in touch, building communities, but also linked to, some negative well-being stuff if you overdo it.
Yeah, totally. So then the pandemic comes along and it really throws a wrench in things. Our physical world shrunk down. So did we just all become even more glued to our screens?
Well, the study's findings definitely suggest that, yeah, they compared social media use during that first lockdown back in April 2020 to what it was like pre-pandemic 2018, and they saw a significant increase in both the U.S. and Italy.
That seems pretty intuitive, right? Like stuck at home, you can't see your friends and family as much. Social media becomes this lifeline.
Yeah, exactly.
Did they find anything specific, though, about how that increase played out?
This is where it gets really interesting. They found that fewer people were using social media for like short bursts, under 30 minutes, but way more people were using it for like hours on end, more than 3 hours a day.
Whoa. Okay, that is a big shift.
It is.
3+ hours is a big chunk of your day. I remember a lot of other research coming out around that time, not specifically this study, but other stuff, pointing to, people's need for socialization and entertainment and just staying informed about what was going on. It was a crazy time.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And while Delogu's study really dives deep into usage patterns, more than asking people directly why they were using social media more, other research like that 2020 study by Gupta and D'Souza really backs up that idea that, needing connection, wanting to be entertained, and staying informed. Those were huge drivers of that increased social media use.
Okay. So overall time spent on social media went up, but they also broke it down by, different groups. What did they find when they compared students to those working full-time?
All right, so this is where it gets really insightful. Full-time employees actually showed a bigger increase in their social media use compared to students, whose usage stayed fairly consistent, actually.
Really? My first thought would have been that students with all the changes to their classes and schedules, that they'd be the ones with the bigger change.
Yeah, it's a reasonable assumption, but the data says otherwise. They calculated what's called an odds ratio, and it was 1.73. Now, an odds ratio basically tells you how much more likely one group is to do something compared to another. So 1.73 means that full-time workers were way more likely to be spending those longer hours on social media.
So those working full-time were even more plugged in than students during this time. What were some of the actual numbers like?
Sure. So both before the pandemic and during the pandemic, a larger percentage of students were using social media for shorter amounts of time, less than 30 minutes or about an hour, compared to those working full-time. More students were also using it for those longer stretches, 3 hours or more, before and during. But that increase in the long stretches, that was way more pronounced for the full-time workers.
That is really interesting. Did the researchers offer any reasons why this might be the case?
They did. They suggested that the huge shift to remote work for a lot of those full-time employees probably meant they had more free time throughout the day and easier access to social media. They also thought that the lines between work and personal life kind of blurring in a work-from-home setup might have contributed.
Makes sense, right? Your office is your living room. It's way easier to grab your phone and scroll. The study also compared what happened in the U.S. versus Italy, right? Those two countries had really different approaches to lockdowns.
Exactly. And the researchers initially thought because Italy's lockdowns were so much stricter, that they might see a much bigger jump in social media use there compared to the U.S.
Yeah, those early lockdowns in Italy were really intense. I remember seeing that stringency index, that measure of how strict the rules are.
Yeah,
Italy was way up there, like 93.5 in April and May of 2020, while the US was more like 72.7. And that 93.5 means Italy was basically on a complete societal lockdown, super tight restrictions, whereas the US, still serious, but a little more leeway in terms of movement and stuff. So what did the data show?
well, surprisingly, their initial hypothesis wasn't really borne out by the data. Both countries did see that increase, but there wasn't a big difference in the size of that increase
Hmm.
between the two countries overall.
You'd think with all those restrictions in Italy, people would have relied on social media even more.
It is a fascinating finding. There was one interesting detail within that comparison, though. When they focused specifically on students, American students showed a pretty significant increase in time spent on social media, while Italian students didn't.
Oh, that's interesting. Any thoughts on why?
The researchers suggested that it could be because of differences that already existed in how students in those two countries typically spend their free time. Maybe more U.S. students were working part-time jobs or had busier academic schedules before the pandemic, so the lockdowns might have actually given them more free time to spend online.
It's an interesting theory for sure. It just goes to show how our individual routines and circumstances can shape how we respond to these big shakeups.
Okay, so we've covered overall usage, differences between workers and students, the U.S. versus Italy. Now, what about individual traits? Did demographics and personality play a role?
Absolutely. They found some clear patterns. For example, men were less likely to spend those long hours on social media compared to women.
Okay.
The odds ratio was 0.47. Yeah, that kind of lines up with what we already knew pre-pandemic about social media use.
It does. They also saw that time on social media tended to go down as people got older,
Right.
with an odds ratio of 0.95. So basically, younger people were spending more time online.
Makes sense. What about personality, though? Like extroverts versus introverts? Did that affect how people used social media during all that isolation?
For sure, they looked at what are called the Big Five personality traits, and they found that people who scored higher in extroversion and agreeableness were more likely to spend more time on social media.
Okay.
The odds ratios were 1.13 and 1.10, respectively.
So basically, people who are naturally more outgoing and enjoy connecting with others were more drawn to social media to maintain those connections. What about the other personality traits?
Well, emotional stability and openness, those were linked to a lower likelihood of spending more time on social media.
Interesting.
Yeah, the odds ratios were 0.88 and 0.90. And then conscientiousness and life satisfaction, those didn't turn out to be significant predictors.
Huh. Well, it really does paint this picture that our personality influences how we use digital platforms, especially when our face-to-face interactions are limited. Now, the study also made this important distinction between active versus passive social media use. Can you break that down for us?
Yeah, this is a crucial point. Active use is, things like posting updates, sharing content, engaging in conversations. You're really participating. Passive use is more like scrolling through feeds, watching stories, just consuming content without actually putting yourself out there. And the study found that there wasn't a big overall increase in that active use during the pandemic.
So even though we might have been spending more time on social media overall, we weren't necessarily creating more content or interacting more ourselves.
Precisely. However, there was this really interesting connection between occupation and the pandemic. When it came to active use, full-time employees were more likely to be posting during the pandemic compared to students. The odds ratio was 1.59.
That's interesting, especially since you said students generally spend more total time on social media. Maybe those working from home were using it more for professional networking or sharing work from home stories.
Yeah, that's a good possibility. The study also noted a difference in active use between the U.S. and Italy that didn't really change during the pandemic. Americans tended to be more active users, posting more frequently than Italians.
Can you give us a sense of those differences?
Yeah. More Italians said they posted about twice a day, while more Americans said they posted 4 or more times a day. And this kind of echoes those overall patterns. Younger people and women were more likely to be active posters. Also, more extroverted folks posted more. And those who were more emotionally stable posted less.
So even with everything changing around the world, some of those established social media habits held strong. The study also looked at the impact of social distancing measures themselves, like how many people someone was in close contact with, and how strictly they were isolating.
Yeah, so this part of their analysis focused on the data collected during the pandemic. And they found that those who said they were isolating more strictly were more likely to spend more time on social media. The odds ratio was 1.19.
Well, they're not really surprising, right? The more isolated you are in real life, the more you might turn to social media to fill that social void.
What about the size of people's social bubbles, though? Did that factor in at all?
Interestingly, no. The number of people someone was in close contact with, what they called bubble size, didn't really predict how much time they spent on social media.
Huh. You'd think having more people around you would make you less reliant on digital connection.
Yeah, you might think so, but in this study, it didn't seem to play out that way. And neither isolation strictness nor bubble size predicted active social media use. And that tendency for Americans to post more than Italians, it stayed the same even during lockdown.
So it sounds like that increase in time spent on social media during stricter isolation was driven more by passive consumption than active engagement. That's how the researchers interpreted it. Yeah. And they pointed out that this shift towards more passive use, especially during a time of global crisis, could be tied to negative emotional states. Other research has suggested that kind of link.
Yeah, and that's kind of a worrisome thought. Just scrolling and scrolling without actually connecting, it can feel more draining than anything else. Okay, so let's bring it all together. What are the key takeaways from this deep dive into the research by Delogu and their colleagues?
Sure, the study clearly shows that the pandemic led to a pretty big jump in overall social media use. And that increase was even more pronounced for full-time workers compared to students. Interestingly, despite those really different lockdown approaches in the US and Italy, there wasn't a big difference in the size of that increase between the two countries, although there were some interesting variations within the student groups. And it seems like a lot of that increased use was more about passively consuming content than actively participating. Finally, individual factors like gender, age, and certain personality traits, all of those things played a role in shaping how people use social media during this really unique time.
And the study raises that important question about the potential negative impacts on mental health, especially with that increase in passive use during a global crisis.
Absolutely. The researchers emphasized that while social media might have been a source of connection and distraction for some during those periods of isolation, for others that shift towards passive use could have actually made things worse emotionally.
So here's a final thought for you, our listener, to ponder. If stricter isolation meant more time on social media, but not necessarily a more genuine connection, what does that tell us about how much we lean on these platforms during times of crisis? And more importantly, what kind of engagement actually helps us feel better? Should we be more mindful about how we're using social media, especially when we're feeling isolated or stressed? It's definitely something to think about the next time you find yourself reaching for your phone when you're feeling disconnected or overwhelmed.